It was a dark and stormy night.
No, really. We had been holed up in the Foy estuary, southwest Britain, for almost 2 weeks, waiting for a weather window to begin our much-anticipated sailing trip to the Caribbean. We were in our new boat, Xanadu of Yelm, a 48-foot cutter built of aluminum. It was early November, 35 years ago. There was one regular BBC radio station that all mariners and others listened to for that great British institution, the shipping forecast. It was broadcast several times a day on a strict schedule, and also as emergency messages when something unexpected was about to happen, like a sudden gale. Storm after storm had raked the English Channel for these 2 weeks. That morning, the guys at the Met Office had forecast a reasonable day. So we decided to make a break for it and at least get to France, wait there if necessary for another favorable forecast, and belt across the Bay of Biscay to Spain, from whence hopefully things would improve. And we were understandably nervous about the crossing of the Biscay in winter. A container ship had disappeared there some weeks earlier. So we dropped our temporary mooring and headed out. Our crew for this trip was the Frost family. Mum, Dee, Dad, me, it's the old salt, and our 3 girls, in order of appearance, Kim, Sam, and Emma. The oldest was Kim, age 16. Also with us was a recent graduate from Plymouth Polytechnic, Ian, and Pepper, our cat and family member for many years. Also taking advantage of the weather window was another boat with roughly the same plan. This was skippered by a lone sailor, a middle-aged American who the kids dubbed Santa Claus, as he had an uncanny resemblance to the great man. He had a very small, at least by our standards, sailboat of some 23 feet, in which he was going to cross the pond. He was, or so we believed, a very experienced sailor. About 10 hours out of Foy, in worsening conditions, the Met Office chaps came back on, profusely apologetic, and announced that a sneaky surprise storm was racing up the English Channel. We, it seemed, was its target. We battled on, having essentially passed the point of no return. Downhill went the weather, rougher became the seas, and colder the watch in the cockpit. Sails were reduced to suit the conditions, and we plowed ahead. We could only manage 30 minutes per person topsides, as it was really cold with the driving rain mixing with ice poles. The seas became, if not mountainous, then at least reminiscent of steep hills. Onwards we pounded, our new boat holding up magnificently. A few hours later, still battling the storm but making progress, we heard a mayday call on the VHF. We could barely make it out, no idea where the boat was located, but it was in English with possibly an American accent. Crossing the English Channel, we had always planned to approach the French coast just before dawn so we could identify our position precisely by homing in on a known lighthouse. GBS was just about coming out and it was very expensive and bulky. We had decided against it. We had closed the coast of Britain. Even in the height of the storm, had been able to make out the loom of La Vierge lighthouse and then the light itself. We decided to run into the Laverache estuary for shelter. I was on deck, as were Kim and Ian, preparing to run the gauntlet of towering rocks that guarded the entrance channel. I went down below to start the engine, trailing my safety line behind me, which was still attached to an anchor point in the cockpit as per standard operating procedures. I started the engine, then the boat lurched wildly, throwing me onto the engine compartment. My safety line tightened as I fell, jamming closed the companionway. I fell heavily onto the clasp of my safety harness, rendering me in great pain and semi-conscious. With the companionway jammed shut, the other two were alone on the topsides, and the rocks were getting closer and closer as dawn began to break over the wild seas. It all started one winter's evening about 2 years previously. My wife and I and our friend Steve D.L. sat down to design the perfect sailboat. Steve is a qualified engineer and naval architect. He was responsible for the interior design of Janet, our previous boat, a Tyler Moldings Olson 38, her sail plan, and he also supervised her completion. Now he was turning his significant talents to the perfect sailboat. She was designed with a large sail locker stroke workshop forward. After that were a pair of identical double berth over-under cabins. Then port, the navigation center, and starboard ahead within the saloon and galley port. After the salon starboard was a torpedo tube berth for the skipper in heavy weather, which Emma, our youngest, claimed as hers. Aft under the cockpit was a centerline double berth owner's cabin with its own head. First, discussion was about what to build it out of. We were going custom again for financial reasons. Glass fiber was rolled out as a one-off GRP hull was very expensive and needed molds. Composite construction methods were also expensive. Steel was ruled out early. Yes, most ports have someone with a welding torch, but steel rusts and is very heavy. So we chose aluminum. It's light, easy to work in some respects, and doesn't corrode, unless there are some dissimilar metals in contact with it. This meant that design and execution had to be precise to avoid cathodic corrosion. But given that, it is an ideal material for a maritime environment. Indeed, many French aluminum boats, the French had lots of experience with aluminum sailboats, weren't even painted and held up exceptionally well. Indeed, we chose a French yard to build the hull and superstructure, and had that shipped to Wistock's Boat Yard, now defunct, in Woodbridge, UK, to be fitted out. The French yard building the hull, decks and superstructure, Metalou, was in Nantes, on the west coast of France. We made a couple of trips there to look at progress, using the cross-channel ferry from Plymouth to France and driving down through Brittany. There was a large but protected cockpit. She was cutter-rigged, and very important, she had a centerboard, so she drew only 5 foot 10 inches with the board up, yet 10 foot with the board down. She was 48 foot overall, with a beam of 14.8 inches. She had a teak interior woodwork and teak decks. Her rig was double spreaders and had 2 forestays, so we could hank on twin head sails for the anticipated wing-on-wing downhill sailing in the trade winds.
Got out of town on a boat from the southern islands, sailing to reach.
Xanadu was launched summer of '82, and boy, what a party we had.
Making for the trades on the outside, and the downhill run to Papahete. Off the wind on this heading line of Marquesas, you got 80 feet of a waterline, nicely making way in the noisy bar. Never run trying to call you, but on the midnight watch I realized why twice you ran away. Think about how many times I had fallen. Spirits are using me, larger voices calling. What heaven brought you and me cannot be forgotten. I have been around the world, looking for that woman girl who knows love can endure, and you know it will. When you see the Southern Cross for the first time, you understand now why you came this way. 'Cause the truth you might be running from is so small, but it's as big as the promise of a coming day. So I'm sailing for tomorrow, my dreams are dying, and my love is an anchor tied to you, tied to the silver train. I have my ship, and all her flags are a-flying. She is all that I have left, and music is her name. Think about how many times I have fallen. Spirits are using me, larger voices calling. What heaven brought you and me cannot be forgotten. I have been around the world, looking for that woman girl who knows love can endure, and you know it will, and you know it will.
And soon she had her sea trials, then a few tweaks, and she was ours. A few weeks later, we sailed her from the Woodbridge near Ipswich, East Anglia where Wistock's yard was, to the River Yelm near Plymouth, Devon. We started loading and moving stuff aboard. We found some issues that needed attention, including a leaking fuel tank. But such delays are to be expected with a new vessel. Finally, we were ready, but a lot later in the year than we'd hoped. Then the weather kept us in port. We sneaked down to Foy between storms and waited. Back near the La Vierge lighthouse at Lappevac, with number 1 daughter Kim at the helm and Ian on watch and working the deck, slowly but purposefully, Xanadu passed the rocks, following the well-marked channel, and entered the estuary. Immediately under the shelter of the land, the sea subsided and the apparent wind decreased. And as the sun rose higher, it actually got warmer. But outside at sea, the wind raged on. The anchor was dropped, the hatch was worked on and soon was opened, and I was made comfortable. The crew noticed the local lifeboat had crew on it, and with lots of hand gestures, etc., they got the message that I needed medical attention. They got me gingerly ashore and into a car, and took me to the next village where there was a doctor, who saw me pretty quickly. Sam, who spoke some French, came with me and obviously made herself understood, as the doc came at me with a syringe the size of a bicycle pump, jammed it into my chest and told me to rest. I was taken back to the boat and propped up in the navigator's chair, which was deemed probably the most comfortable place I could be. We talked about the events of the last 24 to 48 hours and wondered where Santa Claus may have ended up. We talked about the SOS, but we never saw or heard of this Santa again. We stayed the night at anchor, and after breakfast next morning, most of the crew went off to the next village to get medications for me. Another gale was forecast for the night, so we moved over to a stronger-looking mooring and hunkered down. Had a very French lunch of cheese and pâté and hunks of bread and wine. Dinner was roast pork. As the crew said, "We are very well fed on this boat." The forecast gale turned out to be a bit of a damp squib, and so next morning we set sail for Camaret, around the corner past Ushant and to the entrance to Brest. Ian was skipper due to my indisposition, and 7 hours later we tied up in Camaret after a bumpy ride due to the still poor conditions. Liver stroganoff for dinner. All this menu information is from Sam's log. She had this fixation throughout the trip with food. Several days of severe gales followed. Finally, sensing a bit of a weather window, we decided to leave. But we left with some trepidation, as the next leg was across the Bay of Biscay, where only some 5 weeks previously a large container ship had simply disappeared in a violent storm, with no trace ever being found of her. And this was late November, when things usually got seriously out of hand. And so it was that after passing through the Ras de Seine, we set course just west of south for Corunna in Spain. And God must have been watching over us, because not only did the wind continue to abate, it actually ceased entirely, and we ended up having to motor across most of the Bay of Biscay for lack of wind. Go figure. Sam's log, November the 29th. Land was sighted last night. The wind picked up when we were speeding along. Rounded Cape Finisterre mid-morning and had the wind behind us, and we were surfing all the way down the coast. Got to Bayonne after dark. Had a little bit of trouble as one of the lights weren't working. Didn't feel like trying to find a pontoon in the dark, so we anchored. Had a beautiful meal, late as it was, as we were all starving. So we made it safely across Biscay and tied up in Bayonne at the entrance to the Viga estuary. We spent 3 days there, resting and preparing for the next dash down the Portuguese coast, around the bend at the bottom to the marina village of Vila Moura, Portugal, where we planned to spend Christmas. Rounding Cape St. Vincent took us right inshore, and we looked up at the famous cape and its lighthouse, and then hung a left to motor along Portugal's southern coast to our destination near Faro. We arrived December the 5th in the early morning. We tied up temporarily to the reception dock, checked in through customs, got allocated a berth, and set up for a stay of a few weeks. Our stay in Villamora was, well, interesting. First, the climate, even in December, was great. However, after Britain, that's not saying much. The theory goes that Britain became a nation of colonizers because everyone was trying to escape the climate. Second, remember this was 1982, Portugal's paperwork system was horrendous. We spent days getting the right documents for something or other. Third, and more seriously, Portugal was in the process of dismantling, read abandoning, its African colonial system in Mozambique and what became Angola. As a result, those are the indigenous peoples in those countries who for whatever reason felt they could not stay, fled to the motherland. And there they were similarly abandoned, relegated to living in cardboard shanty towns on the outskirts of places like Villamora. Along the road from the artificial village of Villamora to the nearest genuine Portuguese village was a shanty town of literally cardboard boxes in which people actually lived. Fortunately, on a recent visit back there, there's no sign of that temporary village, but I wonder what happened to its inhabitants. Christmas on board was not much different from that on land. We had some decorations and an excellent Christmas dinner after the gift exchange. The next few days were taken up with stocking up for what we expected to be our longest non-stop leg yet, the estimated 6-day voyage from Villamora down the coast of Africa to Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands. Then we checked out of the marina and off we set. The weather was good, but Emma, as usual, took a couple of days to get her sea legs. The trip was uneventful. We tried fishing, nothing came to our hooks. It was very hazy, sand and dust coming off the African mainland. And after the expected 6 days, we rounded the Cape and edged inshore during darkness until we were safely tied up in Puerto Rico, Gran Canaria. We had planned to stay here just a week, but we ended up staying 3, and our trip almost ended here. Sam became very sick. Ever since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, she was susceptible to tonsillitis, and now she came down with a doozy of an attack. All the normal over-the-counter remedies didn't work. Her throat swelled, she couldn't swallow, couldn't take food, and hardly take liquids. She communicated with a notebook and pencil. We visited a doctor who put her on antibiotics, which seemed to work, then didn't. We were getting frantic. Talk of she and her mother flying back to England, and the rest of us going alone. Finally, we went to the hospital where she was injected with a massive dose of antibiotics, and a few days later another. And this seemed to work, slowly improve. So we figured that in about another week she'd be ready for the big jump, the crossing of the Atlantic. Finally, we were ready to go. This next leg was the crossing. The intended route was to leave the Canaries behind heading southish, and when we were closing with the Cape Verde Islands, we would hang a right and head for Antigua. We had filled the freezer with meat and stuff. Dozens of eggs were on the bunk in the spare cabin, where they stayed fresh for weeks, as did fruit and veggies. We had carton after carton of that special milk that doesn't go off, and altogether had enough stores for an Epicurean voyage. So one morning we quietly left the harbor, and with much nervousness as to what lay ahead, we set sail. And what lay ahead was about 3 weeks of sailing, out of sight of land, and exposed to everything that Mother Nature wanted to throw at us. We, of course, wanted to minimize what she would throw, and that's why we chose this route to cross the Atlantic, and why this time of year. You will see that for the summer months, the threat of hurricanes makes it extremely dangerous to embark on a transatlantic trip. The winter months, November through May, are the safest in that regard. Then check out prevailing winds. The Atlantic is almost like a giant pinwheel. In the North Atlantic, prevailing winds are latitude, that is north and south, variable. So in the Northeast Atlantic, northern Spain, winds are typically northwesterly, northerly to the Canaries, and northeasterly from the Cape Verdes. So we went the downwind, downhill route. That's why we had essentially 2 forestays, so we could wing on wing downhill, and that is have a sail out either side of the boat at the front, so that we could go just wing downhill. Our navigation across the Atlantic was a mixture of dead reckoning, astronavigation, and transistor radios. Dead reckoning included a daily update of position based on log readings of miles covered and the compass directions. This was important for the astrobit, as we needed a position where we thought we were, so the astrobit calculations would tell us how far off that point we actually were. We gave up on star sights, the boat was too bouncy, and relied on sun sights early morning and dusk. Sun and moon sights were best when they were both available at dawn. But the transistor radio was most fun. Early on this leg of the voyage, we had picked up on our tranny a station in Antigua playing 24-hour reggae. And being a tranny, it had a rod aerial which enabled us to point the radio in the direction of the signal. So it was continuous reggae which guided us to Antigua, our destination. Observing the local fauna, however, was awesome, in the real meaning of the word. For instance, we had a whale join us and stay alongside for days. It was only about 25 feet long and must have thought Xanadu was its mother. It just swam alongside and one morning wasn't there. Then there was the dawn and dusk feeding frenzies. It brought to mind the old rhyme, big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite 'em, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. For we would see small fish leaping out of the water to avoid bigger fish, who in turn would splash around to avoid even bigger fish, and so on until we could see fish of some feet long being chased by even bigger fish. Every dawn, every sunset, without. And then there was the time we were totally becalmed mid-Atlantic. So we went swimming over the side to cool off somewhat. I was on shark watch with my mask on and saw deep down through the crystal clear water this huge shark slowly wending its way towards us. We all skidded out of the water quickly and watched as the probably 15-foot denizen quietly circled the boat a few times, then swam lazily away.
I don't know why. No use trying 'cause you can't. And so she do it how she wants. Yeah.
And then there were the flying fish. Almost every night some would fly on board and smash their heads against the mast or merely end up in the scuppers. Every morning early, Pepper, the cat, would come up on deck and feast on these tasty morsels. Each was about 6 inches in length, and one day there were sufficient numbers to collect and saute for breakfast. Delicious, if somewhat bony. One day we watched as one swimming alongside became the intended meal of a dorado, or dolphin fish or mahi-mahi. The flying fish took off and flew for some 50 yards, all the while being shadowed in the water by the mahi-mahi, who was there, jaws agape, when it finally hit the water. It was during this period of utter calm, with an almost imperceptible underlying lazy swell, that the almost spiritual feeling came across one. And here we were, clasped to the bosom of the planet, gently rising and falling as it breathed. Then one day things began to change. We began to notice birds in the air, gathering in some numbers to crash dive on the shoals of fish. They were boobies, a land-based frigate bird, indicating that land was not far away. So one morning, knowing from our position checks that we were close, Emma, the 11-year-old, was at the helm when she yelled, "Land ahoy!" She spied the light on Shirley Heights at the southeast sector of Antigua. Soon after, we were at anchor in English Harbor. We loved English Harbor. We had a day or so of intense haze which left muddy dust all over the boat, remnants of a sandstorm from the Sahara Desert the other side of the pond and carried by the trade winds all the way across. The people in Antigua were filled with enthusiasm and fun. The charges around the harbor were exorbitant, the music fabulous, and the poverty grinding. The jitneys were fun, those minibuses which go like bats out of hell down the winding and less than smooth roads.
See no doubt. I need attendance from my nurse around the clock. Cause there's no prescription for me. She's the one, the only remedy. Night nurse, only you alone can quench this your thirst. My night nurse, all the pain is getting worse. I'm hurt by love. And I'm sure no doctor can cure. Night nurse.
We stayed in Antigua for about 5 days, then headed off to St. Bart's, and then to Tortola, British Virgin Islands, where we would meet up with some friends.
a lesson too late for the learning. Made of sand, made of sand. In the wind of a night, my soul is turning. In your hands, in your hands. Are you going away with no words of farewell? Will there be no trace left behind? Well, I could have loved you better. I didn't mean to be unkind. You know that was the last thing on my mind. You got reason plenty for going. This I know. Yes, I know. For the week has been sadly growing. Please don't go. Please don't go. Are you going away with no words of farewell? Will there be no trace left behind? Well, I could have loved you better. I didn't mean to be unkind. You know that was the last thing. Are you going away with no words of farewell? Will there be no trace left behind? Well, I could have loved you better. I didn't mean to be unkind. You know that was the last thing. You know that was the last thing.
Our final destination was Nassau in the Bahamas, where I was to take a position with the University of the West Indies. So after a week in the BVI, which we thought were fabulous islands, we wended our way towards the Bahamas. We went north off the coast of Puerto Rico and Hispaniola and made entry to the Bahamas at Great Inagua. Then we headed to Long Island. This is a very narrow island, and we arrived on the west coast, having missed the east coast. We got attacked by a cold front blast from the north, which stripped the clutch off our anchor winch. In saving the anchor rope, chain, and the boat, or so I keep telling myself, I got severe rope burns on my hands and thighs as I struggled to stop the whole thing unraveling. A radio buff on the island directed us to an abandoned harbor once used by barges getting salt from the extensive salt ponds on the island. And so, relying on radio directions, we surfed this unmarked channel into this harbor, where we rested, cleaned wounds, and got attacked by 4-engine giant mosquitoes. Oh well, we didn't stay long. Headed to the island capital of Clarencetown, and then on to Journey's End at Nassau. After this, our classic trip, we put Xanadu on the market and sold it to a guy who took her through the Panama Canal and to Hawaii. Then she did a circumnavigation with a South African couple. After many more adventures, she became essentially abandoned in Central America, where she has been listed for sale for about 3 years. And no, I won't be buying her.